Herrmann's big Chicago fire season 13 career decision could still be undone in one tragic way. Herrmann's choice to get demoted in Chicago Fire instead of becoming chief doesn't have to be permanent, but promoting him in the future wouldn't necessarily be the triumph it seems. In fact, there's a strong likelihood that reversing his decision at this point would lead to tragic and potentially irreversible consequences for another vital member of the Chicago Fire cast. The biggest shock of the Chicago Fire season 13 finale wasn't just that Herrmann chose not to take the captain's exam, but that he accepted a demotion so his buddy Mouch could become 51's new engine lieutenant. Looking at his history, there's one way Herrmann could change his mind in Chicago Fire season 14. Unfortunately, it comes at a cost. When the 51 first arrives on the scene at the start of the 2025-1 Chicago crossover, his role is to shadow and assist Chief Pascal in overseeing the rescue and cleanup operation from a makeshift HQ at the site of the explosion. However, Christopher Herrmann's soon established as the type not to stay comfortable in that role for long. As the crisis intensifies and the lives of the 51 and numerous civilians are put at risk, Herrmann leaves Pascal to assist Severide in finding the source of the explosion. Herrmann's declaration that he needs to be in the trenches is the sole utterance of the crossover's title, so it can be assumed this is intended as a big moment. Apart from a few interactions regarding Trudy's near-fatal shooting and general updates on the CPD's investigation, Herrmann's interactions in the crossover are generally limited to those with the Chicago Fire crew. Between that and his choice to rush into action rather than remain in a safe location with Pascal, Herrmann's identity as a firefighter above all else is demonstrably clear. This means that Herrmann doesn't get to participate in the 2025-1 Chicago crossover's best character pairings, but it does make it less surprising that he later passes on becoming chief. What's arguably more notable, however, is his reasoning. Herrmann tells Pascal they don't need two people supervising when the battalion chief is already present, making his own oversight redundant. In other words, when there's somebody else willing to supervise, Herrmann's more at home focusing directly on what needs to be done. The finale justifies his demotion because Christopher Herrmann isn't a man who feels comfortable doing his job from behind a desk, but his exchange with Pascal does suggest a specific circumstance in which he might consider becoming chief. Since it's already been established that Herrmann has no interest in leadership while Pascal's still manning the helm, the only reason he would change his mind about becoming chief is if Pascal were no longer occupying the position. He says himself throughout the season that he has reservations about even applying to potentially overtake Pascal's job, even with Bowden's blessing. In fact, this was a concern in the writer's room throughout much of the season as well. As Chicago Fire showrunner Andre Newman told Screen Rant prior to the season finale, it's almost impossible to promote Herrmann to battalion chief without cutting Pascal from the show. Detailing the considerations that had to be taken into account for Herrmann's storyline, Newman explained. Herrmann accepting a demotion was a way to resolve these issues to the benefit of each character involved. Mouch gets his promotion while Pascal keeps his current role, and Herrmann focuses on the part of the job he cares about most, even if it means not advancing in his career. It's hard to imagine his promotion working out as well. If Pascal were going to leave of his own volition, it would have made the most sense for him to retire after Monica died. But Pascal staying at the 51 after his wife's death suggests it would take an even bigger tragedy for him to leave. Herrmann filling Pascal's shoes may even require Pascal to be killed off or fired. It's already confirmed that Herrmann's demotion will stick in Chicago Fire Season 14, so it can be reasonably assumed he won't be changing his mind in the near future. However, this also means that there's little chance of Pascal deciding to leave at the beginning of the season, when Monica's death is still fresh enough to potentially inspire his retirement. After keeping his position through his wife's death and his presumably stressful period as a murder suspect, it would feel tonally off for Pascal to suddenly now retire peacefully with no provocation. That doesn't mean he can't still eventually retire of his own accord, but it makes the most sense at this point to give Monica's storyline some already teeming with surprises, heartbreaks, and cliffhangers. Chicago Fire Season 13 is setting the stage for one of its most gut-wrenching storylines yet. And this time, it's centered around none other than fan favorite Christopher Herrmann. After years of putting his life on the line and pouring his soul into Firehouse 51, Herrmann's recent decision to consider stepping into a leadership role outside the firehouse seemed like a triumphant evolution. But new developments hint that this long-awaited milestone could be undone in the most tragic way imaginable. And it all begins with one phone call. It was the moment many fans saw coming, and yet it's still hit with a wave of bittersweet emotion. In Season 13, Episode 4, Herrmann, the salt-of-the-earth firefighter known for his gruff wisdom and rock-solid heart, was offered a prestigious deputy district chief position. The offer came not just as a nod to his years of dedicated service, but as a recognition of the kind of quiet heroism that's held Firehouse 51 together through every explosion, collapse, and emotional storm. Initially, Herrmann balked at the idea. The thought of leaving behind the firehouse, his bar mollies, and the bonds that have become his second family didn't sit right. But his wife Cindy, still recovering from her cancer scare, urged him to think of the long game. "You've given everything to that house, Christopher. Maybe it's time to give something to yourself," she told him, her voice trembling with pride and concern. By Episode 6, Herrmann shocked his crewmates by accepting the position. Cheers erupted at Molly's that night. Ritter raised a glass. Mouch gave him a bear hug. Even Chief Bowden, stoic and measured, cracked a rare, heartfelt smile. Herrmann was moving up. But just as it seemed he'd finally gotten his due, cracks began to form. Behind the scenes, whispers of budget cuts and bureaucratic meddling started swirling through the CFT chain of command. Herrmann found himself not in the heart of action, but buried in paperwork, caught between outdated policies and a city struggling to modernize its fire department. He sat through endless meetings, reviewed disciplinary reports, and fought to advocate for field teams who were being underserved. The job was changing him, and not necessarily for the better. In Episode 9, a confrontation with a Green City administrator turned physical, not from Herrmann's end, but from a protester furious over how slowly the city responded to a housing fire that claimed 2 lives. Herrmann, standing in the middle of it all, took the brunt of the blame. The moment was broadcast on local news. Suddenly, his new position didn't feel like an honor. It felt like a trap. And then came the tragedy that could unravel it all. Episode 11 opens on a rainy night in Chicago. Herrmann gets a frantic call from Cindy. Their son, Luke, was involved in a multi-car crash just outside the city. He had borrowed Herrmann's old truck for a college road trip and was hit by a semi-driver who swerved to avoid debris. Luke was airlifted to Chicago Med in critical condition. The scene, stark and silent, shows Herrmann clutching his son's broken phone, still stuck on a half-written "Love you guys, see you soon" message. The entire firehouse rallies around Herrmann. Bowden offers to pull strings to give him time off. Cruz brings meals. Mouch sits in the waiting room for hours without saying a word. But nothing can quiet the storm inside Herrmann's heart. "I should have been home more," he says to Cindy in Episode 12, his voice cracking. "I should have been at his games, his graduation, his dumb band rehearsals. Instead, I was at City Hall fighting to keep hydrants from freezing.